Hi everyone, my name is Victoria Vilk. I'm the Program Director for Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America. We are a nonprofit that is dedicated to defending and celebrating the written word here in the US and internationally. Welcome to today's webinar on staying sane, managing threat and trauma, co-hosted by PEN America and the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma in partnership with the Committee to Protect Journalists, the International Women's Media Foundation, and the Freedom of the Press Foundation. By now, we have all seen, and in some cases directly experienced, the ways in which largely peaceful protests against police brutality and systemic racism have been met with more police brutality and systemic racism. Reporters have not been immune. The Press Freedom Tracker, the US Press Freedom Tracker, is now investigating over 430 press freedom violations across the United States, from arrests to pepper spray, tear gas, rubber bullets, and assaults of all kinds, not to mention broken equipment. In partnership with some of the country's leading press freedom organizations, we at PEN are advocating on behalf of journalists and everyone else who are exercising their free expression rights and their First Amendment rights. This webinar series, which is really focused on the health and safety of journalists, but is open to all activists and protesters as well, is part of that effort. Today's session, as I said, is going to focus on mental health and trauma. This afternoon, I'm actually co-leading a session with the Freedom of the Press Foundation on digital safety during protests. If you didn't get a chance to catch Tuesday's digital safety training, we're kind of reprising it. There's going to be a lot of overlapping content this afternoon at 4 p.m. ET. And if you have ideas for sessions, this is a series. If you want us to add sessions, or there are things you really think that we should address or cover that'd be useful to you, just email me and I will see if I can rustle up the right people. Before we start, I do want to tell you about three very important initiatives. The first is that the International Women's Media Foundation has just launched a journalism emergency fund. It is available to all US journalists, regardless of their gender, and it's particularly for immediate needs such as medical aid, destroyed, stolen, or stolen equipment, trauma and mental health services, referrals for legal support, anything that might have happened to you during protests or that you need support with as a result of the coverage. You can get funds through this wonderful new resource, so check it out. The Committee to Protect Journalists is constantly updating its safety advisories around COVID, around the protests on their website. I strongly recommend you take a look at those when you can. And finally, the ACOS Alliance is offering bursaries for a very in-depth, high-level civil unrest and first aid course online. Those courses are normally extremely expensive, but if you are a freelancer, you can apply and do that course for free. So go ahead and check that out. It's totally self-directed. You do the course at your own time as you need to online. I have a little bit of housekeeping to address quickly. As I said, we'll be recording this session for anyone who couldn't make it and making it available online, but we will be very sensitive to ensuring that participants' names are not read out loud and that you folks remain anonymous. I will also be sharing some very useful resources after this session in a form of a Google Doc, so keep an eye out for those. We're gonna have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please, please, please use the Q&A. If you have comments or thoughts or experiences you want to share, use the chat. That way it's easier for me to keep track of what's what and where is where. And without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, whom we're very lucky to have. Elana Newman is the Research Director for the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma and the McFarlin Professor of Psychology at the University of Tulsa. Newman studies, well, Elana, I should say, studies the occupational health of journalists who cover traumatic events and helps journalists learn about trauma science, self-care, trauma-informed newsroom practices, and other ways that psychological knowledge can be relevant to journalistic practice. So thank you, Elana. I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to you, and I'm gonna go on mute and turn my face off, but I'll be here if anybody needs me.
Okay, and I'm going to share my screen, so give me one moment while we do that. Welcome, everybody. Hang on. Screen one. Can everybody see that?
We're good, yeah, perfect.
Great. Well, welcome, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about, Now I can't see anything. Give me 1 second. All right. Today we're going to talk about managing threat and trauma. And I am delighted to be here. I want to start by saying that Victoria has basically pulled this series together very, very quickly. And she's done an incredible job of trying to be responsive to the needs of everyone. And I just want to thank her for her work doing this, and all the organizations that have come together to help on this. So I consider myself a journalist ally, and I want to make it very clear that I am someone who has worked with journalists for a long time, but I am not a journalist. But I have studied journalists, I have trained journalists, I go into newsrooms, and I've been working with journalists since about 1998. The other work that I do has to do with traumatic stress. I train clinicians, I do disaster mental health, and I've done research on a variety of topics. But I just want you to know my perspective. Coming in, I consult, I do work in various areas having to do with trauma, social injustice, substance abuse. So my approach today in putting this together quickly is I'm going to do a brief overview, some conceptual things. I'm going to offer you real practical advice, and that's the thing I want to focus on before, during, and after. And I will focus on protests, but I'm also going to talk a little bit more, and then we'll have some time for questions. And I think that will be really important. I want to encourage you, though I can't see the chat while I'm speaking, and Victoria will be looking at it, to share ideas in the chat, to speak with one another. One of the things that I am going to be continually saying is that having colleagues and sharing information is probably one of the most important things about to be sane. And so I encourage you to do that, and have conversations while I'm speaking. And our plan is that the questions and answers, the Q&A, if you would put specific questions to me, and chat will be the place where you can just have reactions, comments, tips, resources, those kinds of things. So I'm going to focus on rallies or protests, but broaden it a bit. And the way I'm thinking about that is I'm going to give you a set of self-care strategies or tools to add to your journalistic toolbox. Like all tools, like your craft, it can take practice. And it's about practicing. It's a lifelong habit. These are aspirational, and everyone is different. Some of these tools will work for you, some of them aren't. So sort of think of it as a buffet where some of these strategies are going to be right for you and some aren't. And again, use the chat box. These are very general strategies, I should say. And I'm not going, although I study post-traumatic stress disorder in journalists and the science, I'm not going to focus that much on it. And I'm also going to gloss over some of the sort of subtleties. If people have questions about that, please ask me. The recommendations are science-based, but I am oversimplifying a couple of things in my conceptualization, and I just want to let you know that, and I can come back to it. This is just a reminder to tell you that I am in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we are. When we started this plan, I did not think that there would be rallies and protests to cover so close to my home. And yesterday, a friend saw that it isn't Trump. I think it was just that stun guns were being purchased, were being sold on the street for folks where COVID is increasing. So these issues are very up close and personal to me as my community tried to prevent a rally from occurring, and as we prepare for 2 stressful, possibly 3 days ahead of us. So I just wanted to say those were on my mind, and that was my reminder. So I want to start by saying that journalists are trauma and threat-facing professionals. And journalists, you folks are exposed in a number of ways. There's the direct, being an on the scene witness, being present at a scene where people are hurt. There's the personal, being threatened, abused, and harassed yourselves. And I think, as all of you know, in democratic societies, or when I started this work, the personal threats on journalists were not as great as they are now. And I read, though I haven't seen the study, that that recently the National Association of Black Journalists did, I think it was within a 2-week window, I don't know the exact time frame, through a social media poll, found that more than 60 incidents occurred between police and journalists covering current gatherings, protests, rallies. So this is a real issue, and more journalists are being directly targeted. And we designed this to talk about the US situation, and I think that it's pretty clear, and CPJ folks on this call can talk about it, that it has increased the direct attacks on journalists. So there's direct exposure by seeing it happen to someone else, by being there, being exposed yourself. Then there's what we call vicarious exposure. So if you are truly empathetically engaged with your sources and communities that are experiencing trauma, there is that residue, there is that experience, talking with your colleagues, and that is something that happens again and again in the course of doing your work. We've got all sorts of graphic imagery in a professional context that's secondary and more. Naturally, my phone rings. It never rings usually. Sorry for that background noise. It's going to continue. I think there's also moral threat or moral challenges. Many of the stories, many of the issues we're talking about is about a breach in social order, social justice, moral compass. And those are threats that I think are really important, and we don't often talk about them. And finally, many stories that journalists cover interact with personal histories and identities. The evidence shows that these also can come, they're cumulative, and they career-long exposure, they come over time. So there's lots of ways in which you are challenged, and you are, in fact, trauma and threat-facing professionals, though you may not use that terminology. There's also just the daily stress and hassles. And we've got a lot of them now. We've got pandemic-related concerns, PPEs, equipment, we've got logistics, we've got equipment, we've got weather, we've got deadlines. We also have a lot of organizational concerns, and some of the work of my students and I have found that lack of organizational support was actually more debilitating post-exposure than the events themselves. So there are issues here that we can talk about for management, but that organizational concerns also, combined with being exposed, can be very, very stressful. And then there's just simply the news choices you make, deciding what stories to tell. So your jobs are hard. Now, stress is not necessarily a bad thing in response to that. In fact, when you have some stress, you do a better job. It improves performance. If I weren't a little stressed, I would be having some difficulty. It's good that I have some arousal so that I can talk to you and try to be engaged, particularly in this false setting where I can't see your faces, I can't read your chats right now. It's helpful, but it's when it continues over a long time, it's prolonged, when you're working nonstop, where you continue to activate your stress by worrying, or when you don't have any time for recovery, that it can get in the way. So stress is not necessarily a bad thing, and it's part of life, and it's information, and it's important that we understand it, that in short doses and in short ways, it enhances performance. The other thing is, I believe that people sometimes think that being happy and is a goal in life, and I think it is important for us to be fulfilled and happy, but upset and distress is also part of life. It's really when it gets in your way. And I don't think that distress is always a terrible thing as long as it's manageable. If you are distressed about the things going on in the world, well, that shows that you're a moral being. And I think as we talk about, particularly now in the US context, for many of us, it's about time we were distressed by police murders and structural racism. So that distress is not necessarily a bad thing. It's about how we experience it, how we handle it, and whether we use it. So my own approach is that strong, overwhelming feelings are appropriate, and that people don't necessarily need interventions for that unless they get in their way. And I think that moral outrage is actually warranted and is a journalistic tool. Investigative reporters talk about that moral outrage as their identity. And I think journalists use that. It helps storytelling, it helps pay attention. There are many things that one can do where it's really, really vital, and that moral outrage enhances your craft. Again, if it's not excessive. And I think that that's something to be embraced and owned. Now, sometimes it can make you feel better than thou, and sometimes it might interfere with storytelling. So like every reaction, it has a plus and a minus, and I think it's really important that we own that we own that. And then I also think just we're starting to do this work in a pandemic where our routines are out of whack, everything's changing, and we need to have some self compassion, because just managing the pandemic, let alone covering other events in that context where your physical safety is in danger, really requires that we look at those kinds of things. So that's another starting point. The final, well, I have one more starting point, I think. Another starting point is that, for the most part, journalists are incredibly resilient. The research that we've done here and that my colleagues have done all over the world shows that journalists are actually quite resilient given they're exposed at high rates to terrible things. And there are a minority who have difficulties, but they're a minority. The mission of journalism, your craft, ethical decision-making, and colleagues are incredible protective factors. And so it appears that while being stressed is a problem, journalists are resilient. And most journalists feel a little, get caught up sometimes in a story, things get them, and then they return to their equilibrium and are just fine. And so I think that's important to remember, that even as we're talking about stress today, and I should have warned folks, and I realize I skipped over this, that as I have this conversation with you, you may notice that even just talking about this stuff may activate you a little. I would invite you to sort of notice what topics are getting you upset or just feeling a little bit different. Walk away from this if you need to, stretch, get up. But be aware, because that's information, as we'll talk about, if there's anything in particular that strikes you. I put this up for resilience. This is not from journalists, but actually was when I was doing disaster mental health at the Moore tornadoes. And one of the most amazing families that I met while I was doing Red Cross work was this family whose house had been devastated, and this is what they put up. And if you can see it, there's even a dollar sign up there. And it shows that in the face of terrible threat, having a sense of humor. And the kids of this family were happy. Well, I mean, they were upset, but they were also able to play. The family was really coping well, and I think it just is an example of resilience whenever I think about resilience and the importance we'll talk about of humor. And then I think this may be my last starting point. Emotional self-awareness is a journalistic tool. And emotions are information, and my own experience of working with journalists is that there's usually a stigma about talking about emotions in ourselves until we start talking about emotions in our audience. So when I train clinical psychology students, we train people that their emotional state is important to monitor, because if they can name it and handle it, they can be a better aid to their client. In journalism, it seems like we really just sort of don't talk about any emotions till we talk about how are we going to present the story. How is this going to happen? And I think that there's a culture there that needs to be changed, because emotional awareness throughout can enhance the way you gather your data, the way you interview people, your news judgment, the choices you make, the risks you take on the job, and also your ethical choices by being aware of those things. So I think it's a journalistic tool, and we don't often think about it that way. And so I think that's important. And finally, I think you all know this, but I really see staying sane. We talk about this as emotional or psychological self-help. It is part of the profession. If you don't take care of yourself, it can lead to self-censorship, can lead to talented people leaving the field. It can lead to less commitment, lower work satisfaction, and all sorts of things that get in the way. So staying sane is part of your professional identity. It's not an extra. So I just want to say that. And then finally, the last sort of big conceptual thing before I get to practical things, what can we do, is I want to just talk a little bit about coping. And basically the literature says that there's two kinds of coping. There's problem-focused coping where you do something, and there's emotion-focused coping where you regulate your response. Simplifying the literature, problem-focused coping is best when you can do something. When something constructive can be done, it's good to take a problem-focused approach. When the stressor has to be endured, then it's about regulating your own emotional process, response to the problem. And I'm going to be mostly talking about emotion-focused coping, but you'll see in here as well that sometimes it's problem-focused. And that, I think, is an important thing to know about when you think about, well, what strategies will work best for me? How can I imagine and how can I manage all of these things? I'm going to take 1 second to see if there are any questions before I go to now the basics. And I'll invite Victoria to let me know if anything has come up yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
I'm not seeing anything yet.
Thank you. Okay, and I'll pause at certain points and then we'll do it at the end too. But if there's something that wasn't clear, just ask the question and I'll pause. Or Victoria will interrupt me and say, hey, we have an important question, something wasn't clear. So now I want to talk about before, during, and after. And when I've heard from working with some of you is that protests can be both boring and exciting at the same time. So usually there's some parts of it that are really, you're doing a lot of waiting around if you're there for a long time. Sometimes you go in with a story that's short and you decide what you're going to say and what the angle is, and you don't need to be there a long time. You're there for a long time. It can be boring, and then sometimes something can erupt. And that is, I think, again, what the Tulsa community is very worried about. And I just want to point out that that's also a biological challenge, because you have to be both super alert and super calm. Those of you who have done physical safety training know that that in fact is part of it, is being able to be really aware, but also try to remain calm. And that is a biological challenge because you are asking sort of two systems to be going up. And military folks train and train and train for this kind of situation. And I don't think we often think about it in that way. And there is a challenge here that is biological, that is emotional, that is social. So I wanted to sort of point that out. So the first thing to think about before going to cover protests and other events is having that physical safety plan. You can see my cartoon, in case of fire, exit building before tweeting about it. It's really important that your physical safety comes first. And training and preparedness, that in and of itself predicts resilience. It's really important to have that plan. And that is an essential part of mental health and being there. Part of that is anticipating and plan for the basics: snacks, food, water, sleep, having a plan. The other thing beforehand is, I think, and I'm going to talk more about knowing yourself in the next slide, is just as part of your life, we should be aspiring, we can't always do it, to engage in health promoting, life enriching activities. And all of us are better at some than the other. Physical activities, spiritual activities, mental activities, interpersonal activities, and professional activities. So trying to get exercise daily, having some sense of spirituality, whether it's formal religious or connectedness to nature, the things that bring us awe and inspiration, things that mentally fulfill us, hobbies, art, challenges, interpersonal, people, and professional activities like professional development, like the things that you are doing right now, taking time from your schedule to really enhance the way you tell stories and how you take care of yourselves. And we're all, again, better at some than the others, but trying to increase some of the healthy things we do is an important thing to be doing just in general, and I want to take that as a start. So the first step becomes to, if you're thinking about going on an assignment, and now I'm talking particularly about a protest, but it could be anything. These questions will work for you. It's important to know yourself and take an inventory. You should know by now, and if not, I encourage you as we're talking here to write things down. What tell signs are there when you're not at your best? I lose my keys. When I lose my keys, it is a signal that I've had too much stress and I need to do something about it. And I usually lose things that are in front of me. It's a sign that I'm on overload and I might not have even noticed it. So what are your tell signs when you're at your best? And what works when you're not at your best? Is it a break? What helps you get back to that place? Are you someone who runs towards stress or emotional processing, or are you someone who goes away? And we all tend to do that in coping. We either are people who go straight for it, or we like back away. We have a preference. And it turns out that, of course, some skills are better. It's good to approach some things, and it's better, to use other skills or avoid it when you can't change it. But we all have a preference or a style. And it's important to say, when does that help me? And when does that not help me? Again, being some self-awareness of how do I operate in this world? Knowing what your signature strengths are, where do you really do well? And how can you capitalize on those when you're feeling stressed? As I said before, knowing which of those domains come easy to you or come harder to you. I do pretty well on all of them except for physical. I don't do enough exercise, and that for me is my area of growth, and I know that. So I have to really plan for that. How is your identity in politics related to this particular event? That's another thing to understand. It can be a great asset. We all bring different histories. We all bring different experiences. That all helps reporting. But it's important to identify it. It may or may not require some craft choices about ethics. To what degree do you disclose your relationship to this or not? It may affect the way that you feel and experience things. And I hope that we'll have some time to talk about that. But it's very important to name that. And some of these, sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not so obvious. So anticipating that. One of the best strategies for coping with difficult times, if anything, is thinking about how'd you do it last time? What got you through? Do more of that. What got you through a tough story? Do more of that. It's also helpful to think about what didn't work so well. Maybe I should try that. Maybe I drank a little bit too much. Just thinking about that. And my colleague, Dr. Porterfield, she often talks about that strategies can be helpful and problematic. And I think that that's absolutely true. Humor can be a wonderful thing. I use a lot of humor, but it can also lead to depths to insensitivity. Alcohol and drug use can be fine if it doesn't get in your way versus totally self-medicating. Disconnecting is a really good thing to do. But if it becomes total avoidance, that's a problem. Anger, and I'll talk more about anger because I think moral outrage is a really important aspect of covering these things versus rage where it's uncontrollable. So just sort of thinking about that and not really having judgments. Hey, when's it work? When doesn't, Everything's got a plus and a minus. And I think it's realistic here to think about that. So know yourself and anticipate what's going to be hard for you. And what's really going to set you off, and know that. And so we're going to talk about making a plan that works for you, and I'm going to get more in detail about that. That's out of place. I'll come back to that. All right. So we're going to make a plan that works for you before, during, and after. And I'm going to start with before. Oh, wait, I already did that. I got lost. All right, so we've talking about making a plan that works for you. We're going to talk about the before, which we're just finishing up. We're going to talk about during, and we're going to talk about after, and identifying your social supports. So I wanted to put this, give me 1 second. I think this is going to go away for 1 minute, and I hope that I can get it back. If I can put this in the chat, this is now taking all my technical, I can't get it to the chat from where I'm sitting. All right. I will put that in the chat when I'm done. The DART Center in Asia, our Asia Pacific office, has a series of 10 to 14 minute videos done by Kamina Lyle, who's the deputy director, but she's also a yoga instructor. And these are all some nice resources in thinking about some of those practices that you do at home before and thinking about those things. Another tool that we've developed is just simply assessing your stress. Right now, I ask you, all of you, to just silently say, at what level would you rate how you're feeling right now? You're talking to me, we're having kind of a conversation about stress. What level would you rate now? On a typical day, where are you on that level? Some of us operate real up here, some of us operate down there. Where would you say? And what do you think would be your baseline? If you imagine yourself going to cover a protest or a rally, what do you imagine your stress to be? Just again, being able to think about that and know that, I think, is very important. And being able just to quantify it and think about that and become aware of your stress level. The next thing I think, and going into thinking about before, is we know that social support, both giving and receiving, is probably the biggest predictor, or it's one of the bigger predictors of well-being, mental health, physical health, you name it that's good, it's associated with it. And social support takes many forms. It doesn't necessarily have, it can be how large your network can be, it can be small, and it takes many forms. It can be about sharing information, it can be emotional, it can be about esteem, reminding people that they did things well. And so social support has lots of different ways it operates. But I think that one of the things that we often do is we don't think about who do we go to for the kind of support we need at the time. So I'd like you to engage with me for a minute in thinking about if you had a work-based journalistic ethical dilemma, who would you think you would go to? Okay. If you had a personal problem, who in your world would you go to? The third question is very similar. When did you experience collegial support? And what did that person do for you? One of the questions I've been getting a lot is how do we support journalists of color right now? This is an important question, which is to think about when did you experience collegial support and what did they do? What kind of support is needed? Often I know to myself, sometimes when I'm stressed, I go to the person that when we were not working remotely, I went to the person who was physically proximate to me instead of the person who might be the best person to help me with the support that I needed. So thinking about that, also, how do you give support to others? And what are the assumptions you make about what kind of support your colleagues need? If you want to be an A-team, if you want to be a good colleague, and many of you think it's really important. So Finally, you don't always have choices about whether you cover protests, rallies, or other traumatic assignments, but sometimes you do. And I do think the self-assessment should have a question is, should you go right now? Are you up to the exposure for, here I have extreme distress or any distress of others at this time? Are you up for it? Have you had anything recently in your world that's going to make it a little more difficult? Recent losses. Is there anything going on at home that you really need to be around for? Is there some reason why you're feeling more vulnerable than usual? And again, I think all of us as a society are feeling more vulnerable than usual from the pandemic, let alone other kinds of things. And are you physically well at this point? So those are things, when you have the choices, I think it's really important that part of this, and one of the reasons has to do with control, and one of them has to do with just knowing yourself. There are some times when this story, as important as it might be, it may not be the time for you. And there are risks, of course, professional risks, but more people need to do that and say, nope, this isn't the story for me today. Tomorrow maybe, but not today. And I think that's important. So let's go to during. One of the most important things during is that doing good work in itself, as I said, is protective. Having a sense of purpose. Why are you covering the story? What are the stories you need to tell? Why is this work meaningful to you? I often encourage journalists when they're not on site to create a file of all the compliments or awards or things that were meaningful to you, stories you think that you covered really well, and have a file at home of those things so that when people start attacking you, if there's online harassment, for example, when there are times that you're feeling bad, that you can go back and remind yourself, oh, yeah, okay, this may have not done so well, but this went terrific. This was so important. So remembering the importance of journalism. I mean, I, as a clinician, I train clinicians, very important work. I teach about trauma, I teach important things, but you have the capacity to reach so many more people and provide that information. It is why I love working with journalists. Your work is so important. It is so important and so valuable. And sometimes I think you forget that. You forget that in the frustrations or when you're not doing things. The other part is we've learned that ethical regrets lead to some distress. And so being professional and being ethical is really an important resilience thing, doing your job well, making those hard choices. Those things in and of themselves are part of a self-care strategy. Doing your work the best you can. So one of the most important things that we found out about stress is that, as I said, everybody has an optimal level of arousal, but what happens is if that continues for a long time, you're not able to take breaks, you make it continue because of your own worry, or you don't have a chance to recover. You can manage stress if you have recovery time. And there's lots of studies that indicate that kind of stuff. So one of the most important things on site is to try to figure out ways, if you are reaching that high stress level, that thermometer that I showed you, that you can reduce that arousal some. And there are all sorts of strategies, and I'm going to now offer some. Some are going to work, some aren't. And I'm going to ask you to join with me in thinking about some of these strategies. So we often think, oh, self-care involves going on vacation, it's taking time. I'm talking about the little quick stuff. What is it that you can do to, at least in the moment, and maybe you have 5 minutes, maybe you can make it a half hour. So I'm going to start with the simple things. What physical things can you do? You can stretch. You can take a deep breath. You can relax and tense your muscles. You can take a short walk. You can exercise beforehand. That may take a little longer. Mentally, do you have a picture on your phone of something that makes you happy? A child, a loved one, a beautiful place, a quote. Do you need a 3-minute song? I sometimes close my door and blast music for 3 minutes and then go back to what I need to do. Something silly, something that makes you laugh. Imagine something beautiful, a place you've been, a person you know. A soothing image. Have a safe place in mind. Sometimes simply just taking a break and counting. What are the number of red hats? Just to get your mind away from your work for 2 minutes and then go back to it. Things that are social. Making a quick phone call. Talking to a colleague. So now I want to ask you all, and again, I'm going to have to see how I can get back into the chat. I may have to take my slides off for a second. What else can you do? And I'd love for you to use the chat box for 1 second, and I'm going to stop sharing for just 1 minute so I can see the chat box. What are other strategies? Anybody have any others to offer that they can put in the chat box? It's hard to make a Zoom interactive, so I'm trying. You've got one? Yeah, please. Just type them all in. We're going to take a second while people are typing them in. Dance for a few minutes. That's a great strategy. I do something called box breathing, and I was just going to demonstrate that. Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. And there's all different kinds of breaths, and it may take a while to find the kind of breath that you need, but this breath, I'm glad you found that useful. Anybody else have a strategy they use on assignment that helps them? Well, you can keep it going, close your eyes and think back to a favorite memory or a favorite place, someone said. These are all incredible strategies, and you have that knowledge about things that you may even do automatically that you've never really thought of that help you. And so I'll encourage you, I'm going to go off of this to keep sharing those. Transcendental meditation for me. So you all are realizing what it is that works for you. Some people do mindfulness. I talked with a journalist, hang on a second while I get this back on, who had said that when they were covering 9/11, that I haven't shared my screen yet though, when then they were can you confirm that I have the right screen?
No, you got the wrong one this time.
I've got the wrong one this time?
Yeah,
Thank you.
To the other screen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I might be able to quickly talk you through the chat, but I'm also keeping an eye on it, so I'll pipe in if anyone else offers other things.
Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit harder for me to keep up. All right, let me go back to which screen it was. Sorry. Thank you for being patient with me while I do technology. Is that good?
That's perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So these are strategies, and reducing arousal, I think, is probably one of the most important things to think about. Okay, next. So this was the box technique. And so I'm going to invite you, if you want to do it, if you don't want to do it, ignore me, walk around. For some people who are really, really anxious, sometimes some breathing can make things worse. It happens very seldom, but it does happen. So I want to invite you, those of you who want to just try that technique with me, a breath technique, to close your eyes, comfortable where you are. Breathe in through your nose, slowly counting to 4. And I'm going to use it at my pace. You may find another pace. 1, 2, 3. Feel the air filling your lungs. 4. Now hold your breath and slowly count to 4 again. Try not to clamp your airways shut. Simply avoid inhaling or exhaling for 4 counts. And I'll let you do that on your own. And then exhale for 4 counts. Slowly. Let's try it again, and we'll do it at your own pace since my counting may have been off. So hold the exhale for another 4 counts. So let's start again. Breathe in through your nose, slowly counting to 4. Feel the air filling your lungs. Then hold your breath, count to 4. Just avoid inhaling or exhaling. And then exhale slowly to the count of 4. Now, this can be very effective. Some folks have said, I've been actually working a little bit with docs too, that this isn't so helpful if you're wearing a mask. So again, depending on your PPEs, there may be a time for this and a time not for this. Let's try another breath technique. And there's many of these, you can look them up. There are all sorts of yoga breath techniques, but these are just 2 that I wanted to try. So sit on a chair, use the type of knees bent, shoulders and head relaxed, and sit in a comfortable posture that's comfortable for you. Now I'm going to invite you to take a minute and inhale slowly and deeply. And I sometimes put my hands on my stomach. Inhale slowly and deeply, really allowing your abdomen to engage fully. You should feel it coming out. And try to breathe so slowly that no sound can be heard. Feel that air coming into your lungs. And when you can't get any more air in and your abdomen can't go out anymore, then start to expand your chest outward and upward. And while your ribs are expanding and they inhale just a little bit more, and then exhale. So really breathing deep, feeling your tummy come out and practicing that. Another technique that may work. A lot of people like this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 coping technique for when they're anxious. And what you do in the moment is you say, what are 5 things you can see right now to yourself? What are 4 things you can touch? 3 things you can hear? 2 things you can smell? 1 thing you can taste. This isn't always the best one to do if you're at a site where there's a lot of carnage or horrible things, but 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. It can be a moment too of just a quick little break. Sometimes people describe being spacey, disconnected, like things seem surreal, and that can happen. It happens sometimes. For some of you, this may never happen and it doesn't matter, but we have something called grounding. And sometimes if you feel yourself sort of leaving your body, counting something benign around you, squares, yellow hats, touching the objects around you, feeling the mask against your face, feeling the microphone, feeling the pen, feeling your phone, whatever it is, your equipment. Sometimes just slapping. My friend and colleague, Kate McMahon, and runs our Asian office, talks about slapping yourself, stomping if you're standing, doing things that make you feel engaged. So my point here again is that there are all sorts of things that one can do. Small things in the moment, things ahead of time, they don't have to be long, but they're important. Taking a sip of water when you need to. I want to mention that when you are covering a beat or a story for a long time, protests, racism, this whole issue for journalists about taking a day off, I think, is a hard one. I think when you're on a really important story, you want to do that story well and you want to continue. It's really important. At the same time, if the story is going to be around for a long time, you need to take a break. That is from the mental health point. I understand that is a dilemma for some, and I think you have to do a cost-benefit ratio and really figure out, is this about you? This is a quote from a reporter covering the protests, and he or she I think said, I found myself not wanting to leave work or step away for a break because I'm afraid that without me, there something offensive or even racist will go on the air. That's a real concern. So the question becomes asking yourself, is that, how realistic is it? How bad can it be? And it might be really bad. Is it worth, do I need to be there for the long haul? Is really sort of questioning yourself to the degree which that is true, and the degree that that's important to you and at what cost? You got to just make those choices. And I think it is a dilemma because doing a story well is important, but you got to also take a break sometimes so that you can do and tell the story better. Cultivating optimism. We know that people who are resilient do best. So this is not Pollyanna, like pretending that the world's a great place when it isn't, but like, what's one small positive change? What's one small thing? Is there hope? Cultivating that. I am hanging on to every little piece of good news these days as I can. Anytime you can think about these obstacles as growth opportunities is helpful. And again, I'm not trying to say, you know, put a happy sign on it, but it's as important to think about these obstacles, particularly these challenges, as things that you can, you know, manage. Look for role models. Who in your profession, who in your world is doing an amazing job, and what do they do? And celebrating the small victories, the small, great work that you're doing. Sometimes when you're telling a story, you forget to sort of say, hey, that was a pretty good story. Hey, look where that was. And when it's a long period, again, seeking out any activity that provides support, that increases relaxation and decreases arousal, provides challenge, somehow recharges you and replenishes you, and changes the way you think about work. And most of the time, those are activities where you disconnect or a way that helps you sort of see your successes. So the other thing for when it's a long period, some people are natural worriers and some people just worry. And worry and rumination is real in today's world. I mean, there's lots to worry about. My advice there, and worry is a problem because what happens is even though the stress has gone away and you may be off work, or at least for a little bit, you're continuing that arousal. And again, worry is real. And some of us are more prone to it than others. Focus on today, not tomorrow. Sometimes make a list of what you can and can't control, and then focus on what you can control. Folks like me, mental health professionals, actually recommend that if you are a worrier, is that you set a worry time each day. You're going to worry from this time, it's in your calendar. And anytime a worry comes, you can write it down, you can put it in a jar, you can just make a list, and you say, okay, I'm not going to worry about that. And then you set your time, and that's the time you worry. Sounds stupid? It works. Any kind of distraction and detachment can sometimes help if you're a worrier too. So those are some practical ways to deal with worry. Then let's go to after. After. And after can be short-term or long-term. I really encourage journalists, and sometimes there isn't an after, in particular with COVID, there isn't an after. I understand all that. But there are times where you stop working. Having some kind of routine or boundary, ways that you can separate your work. I've been working with a lot of journalists in New York who are in small apartments, and I'm recommending, like, at the end of the day, when you're ready for bed, you just put a blanket over your computer if you're not using it for fun, that you really sort of have that separation that's very real. Having a routine about how you end your day, and that's particularly important when fewer and fewer of us are on assignment because of physical issues. Thinking about social support. So re-entry after a large story or short story. Maintaining your sleep. What we know about sleep is that sleep is essential and it often goes. Trying to keep to some routine, having a bedtime ritual, not reading news before bed. Exercising is an important thing to do as much as you can. Watching your alcohol and drug intake. And as I said, in small doses, it can be fine. If it's problematic. Strategies. Many of you are natural storytellers, and journal writing may be really helpful just to process your own reactions. Worked with photographers who, after a long assignment away, created a narrative just for them that was not for production, but a string of a narrative that helped them with their imagery. Gratitude. Evidence is clear, and this is about optimism, which is as much as we focus on all the things that are bad, is trying to remember the things in our lives that are good. We are alive, we have loved ones. And I really thought this was a silly strategy. And I have to tell you, I started doing it myself about 3 months ago. And it has been incredible. So at the end of every day, and some people have jars, I don't do that, but some people have jars, some people have journals. I just, before I go to bed, I think of 3 things that day that I'm grateful for. And it has really changed my mood and approach. And I would encourage people to try things like that. And then, of course, to go back through and say, hey, so I had this plan. Here's where it worked. Here's where it didn't work so well. And okay, what do I need to do a little bit more of? This is a work in progress. It's aspirational. There's no great copers. I mean, maybe there are, but we're all in this process of sort of how do we naturally respond? And it's like telling a story. You know, you do the best you can and you learn and you grow from it and you learn new crafts. It's the same thing here with doing this kind of work, to review and modify. Hey, I didn't do that so well. I need to do a little more of that. So I really want to encourage that. So going back to that plan is you get ready, you think about the skills you can practice to manage stress before, and then you think you do about 1 or 2, 3 things you can do at home or during it. During it, trying to lower that arousal, knowing what strategy works best for you, and knowing interpersonally who to call. Following, what's going to help you sort of come out of it, and there are all sorts of issues there, how you can get support at work, and doing the things that help you feel better and are more able to do your work. I want to mention that sometimes you might need extra help. A tune-up. If you come to situations with your own vulnerabilities, whether they be physical or mental health, sometimes some of your work is going to get to you. The times that I would worry is if your sleep is messed up for lots and lots of days. If you're having suicidal thoughts, if you're having really difficult concentration difficulties, you're feeling really depressed, and if your pre-existing vulnerabilities have come up, things that you thought you'd licked sort of shown up, then it's time for a tune-up. That might be a time for professional help. And we'll also have, for the DART Center, we have a little thing on how to choose a therapist, how to use your journalistic skills to know, at least for a trauma therapist, who's available in your community. So sometimes people need a little more help, but right now we're really talking more about taking care of yourself. So my little summary here in this hour, and hopefully, and then I really hope that we can talk about questions or specific things, is that self-care and staying sane is a process. And it has no limits or time frame. And it could be big, like taking that wonderful vacation, or it could be small. It can be small little things. It can be things you do at the end of the day, those kinds of things. One of the things that I haven't talked about because of, I was focusing on riots, but I am thinking about it, is that we really need to be thinking about our relationship to our technology. It's an important tool. It helps you do your work. But setting some boundaries with these objects. I'm on my computer, I have this, I have another phone. All of this is that this can make it much harder to set boundaries around work. And I do want to encourage you to think about, are there times where you don't have to be connected and that you can set some boundaries, put your phone on sleep, do those kinds of things. So a lot of the work at the DART Center is based on the work of Southwick and Morgan, and they talked about resiliency factors, and I just want to sort of repeat them because they really are important. Having a supportive community in whatever format that is for you is really important. Having resilient role models, having a strong sense of who you are, what you believe, and why you do what you do, your moral compass. And for me, that goes along with purpose and meaning. Journalism has very strong moral, ethical code, and there's purpose and meaning, and really remembering that. Trying that optimism, humor, and fighting spirit. Having some sense of transcendence, faith, religiosity, a connection to something else. Approaching what you can approach that makes sense. I didn't talk very much about that. I didn't talk very much about acceptance, but it is that sort of issue of what can you change worry about what can't you, using your personal skills and training. And even just taking a little time, an hour today, that's an example of training that you are thinking about how you can be a helpful colleague. And with that, I will probably open it up for questions. I welcome you. Actually, all of our partners have important resources. The DART Center, you can check out the DART Center for more information, our website, our Twitter feed, and our Facebook feed. But I would encourage you to actually check out a lot of the resources elsewhere. But for these kinds of issues, the DART Center has a lot of opportunities. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and move to questions. Okay.
Elana, let me jump in. So I'm not going to read out loud who the question is from,
Okay.
but it's a difficult question, right? It's clearly someone a reporter who's in a situation. I can turn my video on so you can all see my face. A reporter who's in a situation where he or she clearly is concerned for their physical safety in their life. I don't have specifics.
Yeah.
And is being encouraged by safety folks to lay low, not to do their reporting, not to be visible because their life might actually be at risk. And so, I wrote a private note in response about some of the specifics of that, but I think the question that is the important question here, because of your expertise in mental health, is what do you do when how do you cope mentally when the thing that keeps you going is your work, it is your passion, it's your purpose, and you are being told that you can't do it to keep yourself alive? And so if you can offer any guidance about how to try to take care of your mental health when you are in such a difficult bind to get you through, that would help a lot.
Yeah, I think these are these life and death questions, and they're really, it is a dilemma, because the very thing that gives you meaning and the importance of telling the story is being said. I guess the question I would ask are, first of all, is that true? If it is true that what is the risk here? And really understanding if that risk is the case, that it is an imminent threat, then you're not going to be able to tell any other stories, and maybe you can find peace that way. It may be the case that you disagree with the risk. And in that case, what can you do in that situation? If you're being told that it is too dangerous, then are there other ways? Again, I would go sort of to craft that story can be told where you don't have to be there. Are there ways to go around the story? And again, I'm not a journalist, but in sitting through conversations with journalists, one way of control is sort of thinking about, is there another way to approach the same story that doesn't require me being present? Is there a way I can do it in that approach? But I think that, many of the things that, these are just complicated issues. I think those kinds of things, if the risk is real, then the question becomes, and the way I think I would frame it for myself is, if this is a life or death situation, then I may not be able to do that. It may also be the case, some journalists, as we can see in the news this week, are being imprisoned for taking these kinds of risks. And some people believe that's worth it. It may not be. I'm just babbling. I don't have any words of wisdom other than to say, the other thing I would say from a mental health perspective is it would be helpful to consult with colleagues, perhaps ethicists. CPJ, one of our sponsors of this talk, are very helpful in these areas. If part of it is trying to understand the risk and those things. So I don't have a real answer other than to say you got choices. You can change the way you see it, or you can make different choices. And these are incredibly some of the issues.
Elana, another question. There's a note, you said you weren't going to talk about PTSD, but can you talk about it a little bit?
Yes.
How do you know if you might have it and need help, and what kind of help should you seek?
Sure.
Big question, but an important one.
It is. So those red flags that I said before, if you start to really have what I would say is intrusive memories, if you're having lots of nightmares, lots of difficulties, with that, if you're finding yourself avoiding kinds of issues, if you're feeling suicidal, if you're feeling unable to concentrate, all journalists are hypervigilant. And I would also say that to be Black in America, you're hypervigilant. So I think a lot of people have a level of hypervigilance that is appropriate and helps you do your jobs. So, but if it's changed and become even more so, and it's getting in your way, and if you're finding yourself really, your thoughts are changing, that's really important. I would like to share my screen for a second because I did anticipate this. And I just want to show you some of those issues. And again, let's see if I get the right screen. I believe it's this screen I need. Current slide. Can you see that? Have I shared?
No, not yet.
Oh, well, then that's not very helpful. That's this one. Okay. Let me show you the slide. It's a little bit hard to see in the colors that it is, but typically the symptoms that you see is you're exposed to a life-threatening event. And for journalists, we actually changed it in the process of or work during their duty of jobs. It can be intrusive memories, distressing dreams, having flashbacks, really becoming vitally upset at reminders, feeling real arousal with cues, avoiding memories, feelings, and thoughts or reminders. So I've worked with people who've gone way out of their way to avoid particular areas. Having a negative cognition and mood, can't remember some important part of what happened, really starting to feel badly about yourself, the world, or others that's inappropriate to the situation. Feeling a profound sense of blame for no reason. Being down in the dumps, having a real bad mood, feeling detached and distant from everyone. Not being able to feel any positive emotions, and then more hyper arousal than usual. So more trouble sleeping, irritability that's really out of control, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle, reckless or self-destructive behavior. And it has to get in your way. And in actuality, one of my talking points is often we talk about like I have PTSD when we mean I'm stressed. PTSD, in order to have it, you have to have actually one symptom from here, this many from there, that many from there. And so I think it's really important to distinguish PTSD from having also trauma reactions that can be normative, but and that go away. There's one more thing that I'll mention while we're at it, because I do like to talk about that, is that, as I said, journalists are resilient. Like most of them, in studies, it's like 80% to 100% of journalists are exposed to traumatic events, but rates really vary. And you'll see that war correspondents and people who cover narco trafficking, and then there's this one study of Korean journalists where it's quite high. It really varies by sample who has it, but it is an occupational risk, but it's pretty low. So it varies by your specialty. So that's how you know. And if it's the case, then I think it's time to seek some additional help to see what's there. One of the great things about post-traumatic stress disorder, there isn't a great thing about post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a terrible thing to say. But one of the reasons I do this work is that particularly if you get treatment when you first notice it, there are many effective treatments for it. And I guess, living in COVID where there's no treatment, that is what was motivating that terrible way I phrased that. But it is really important to know that there are effective treatments that can help, most of them psychological. There are medicines that work, but they only work for the most part as long as you take them. So there are lots of solutions.
Elana, let me point to a couple more,
Yes.
flag a couple more for you. What about a situation in which you are being abused and traumatized by your colleagues and isolated through gaslighting, defamation, or similar? So the people that you think that you would turn to for support, you can't.
Yeah, well, it's one of the, first of all, I'm sorry that's happening. we recently did a study that we haven't published yet that also indicated that sexual harassment is more likely to come from your colleagues than it is from your sources for journalists. And so I think that one of the things that you're naming is that there is a lot of this that goes on, and that there's a culture change that needs to happen. And that unfortunately, this is one of the issues in the profession that we aren't talking about as much as we need to. I think that the first thing that I would say is, who is your go-to people? If it's not in your area, where do you get support? Who are your confidants? Who is that person that you can talk to? And finding a supportive group for that help. And I would just say it doesn't have to be the people in your office. Then figuring out, or in your world, we don't have offices these days, and then figuring out what can be done and what's possible, and then how can I take action. But I think this is a really important issue. And I would say finding the right confidant, whether that's in your personal life or elsewhere, is a first step. And then making some choices about, is this reportable? Is this not reportable? How do I change the culture? And I do think this is a culture change that needs to happen. And I'm sorry.
There's a question about, it's a big question. How can editors and managers cope with the guilt and responsibility they feel asking their reporters and photographers to step into harmful situations, getting pepper sprayed and tear gassed when these employees have also been asked to come in overtime?
Yeah, well, I think there are, this is more part of the organizational strategies that I think that we need to think through in general about doing a before, during, and after with managers and editors, which is having trainings like these, being clear about the risks ahead of time, making realistic arrangements to be in touch with people, and exit strategies, providing safety training, having a mechanism for notifying loved ones. I think that setting up systems where you are supporting people during and after can mitigate some of that, but that there is also a culture change that needs to happen in terms of thinking about that and acknowledging that, which is we need to prepare journalists both emotionally and physically and for the risks that they take. And this is a very hard time. You know, I didn't put it on my slide just for the industry, and those cause so many stressors as well, as you're saying. I think, again, I would say to an editor that, or manager, that first of all, one of the ways to address guilt is mission. But one of the questions that I also would say is, I guess the question becomes, particularly now with COVID and that we've become more skilled at asking, is this story worth it? Is it worth the physical risk? What story? There are stories that are worth the physical risk. And that's, again, a journalistic and ethical choice. But I would also say that that is a question for editors to ask themselves more generally, which is what stories are worth the physical risk, and trying to make those things better. But there is certainly guilt, I think, there. And so a response for guilt in general is thinking about, what am I responsible for? What needs to change so that I don't feel that way in the future? What system needs to change? How am I responsible, and what's there?
I want to say there are some questions cropping up that I think have a lot to do with threats on one's life and physical safety. And I will just say humbly that I don't feel personally that I have the training in kind of threat assessment, which are usually folks who have a security background. I suspect Elana feels the same way. We can't weigh in on the particulars of whether the threat that you're experiencing is something that you need to take seriously, or if it's something that is an empty threat and you don't need to take it seriously. What I will say, I'll say several things. One, if you're dealing with online abuse, And sometimes that comes in the form of threats. Sometimes those threats are anonymous and it's very hard to tell how seriously to take them. I would encourage you to do several things. We have an entire manual. It's called the Online Harassment Field Manual. It has a threat assessment page. It talks you through how to ask yourself some core questions about your safety, which I've developed with several high-level security experts at major media organizations. So run through the questions on that list and try to figure out if there are red flags or cues. But I would also say if you work in a newsroom and you feel safe and you trust your manager or your editor or your colleagues, talk to some other folks, run through those questions on your threat assessment with other people, because we have a tendency to downplay our own kind of concerns. And sometimes having a listening ear is really, really helpful. So if there is someone in the institution that you work for that you feel safe talking to, tell them about the threats that you are getting. Document those threats, take screenshots and save the links of any kind of threats that you are getting. If it's email, save it. If you feel safe engaging with law enforcement, which frankly, not everybody does, and in some countries, and it's depending on your demographic and who, your background, you may not feel safe engaging with law enforcement. If you feel safe engaging with law enforcement, bring that documentation and file a police report. Because even if in the moment the police can't help you, when you file a report, you're creating an official paper trail, you're creating a record so that if you have to actually seek a restraining order against someone or file some kind of, seek some kind of legal assistance, having a trail of police records where you've reported threats to your life is vital, especially if you have documentation to back it up. And I would just encourage you, if you're dealing with online abuse, to spend some time with the Online Harassment Field Manual. I'll also tell you that I wrote an article essentially called How to Cope with Online Abuse. It's in Slate for free. You can get it at Harvard Business Review. I can make sure it's on the resources list. I also frequently run trainings about how to deal with online abuse. And if there's interest, I'm happy to do one of these trainings as part of our webinar series. I'm going to pause for a minute and try to fish out if there are questions that are kind of to Elana's expertise while we have Elana here that have to do with coping with kind of trauma and mental health and resilience kind of questions. So I just want to
okay. And while you're doing that, Victoria and I have actually, we weren't planning this seminar. We actually had planned to meet because one of the things that we're developing at the DART Center is just also some psychological tips on how to manage the emotional aspects of online harassment. And there are some emotional aspects, again, before, during, and after, very similar to some of these, but also that have to do with even just trying to figure out your risk involves having some self-awareness of like how revved up am I, how able am I right now to make good assessments, and the kinds of before-after planning. So we hope to have that resource available soon, and we do have a few tips on already also on the DART website on that, and trying to think more about ways, because we often talk about the practical strategies and there are important threat assessments. I don't know anything, I can't speak to threat assessment, but there are psychological components of that. And a lot of the tip sheets haven't taken into account, we're human beings, we react to information. Like how can we incorporate that? And we've been having, that was actually our first discussion when this happened and she was like, wait, can we do this? So these are important things. So I can speak more generally. And again, I would say a lot of what we're saying here, but although, again, figuring out who can you trust, where can you get your support while you're managing these many issues would be just a general response.
Elana, a reminder to us both, there's a request to make some of the studies that you were citing available. So if you could email those to me, I'll put them in the resource document.
Yeah, and I've already sent you sort of the summary document that has some of that in it. So I think we're ready. You plan to have a whole link of some of the summaries. And I did put in the chat box just all the yoga
links.
Videos,
Yeah.
the links.
Videos. I'm trying to, there's a lot of different, people are kind of mixing the comments and the questions in different places. So I'm just trying to make sure that I've caught anything that we feel equipped to address, Elana and I. Let me see. Let me just say, if you're uncomfortable asking a question publicly in the chat, sometimes people email me. I'm going to keep an eye right now on my email. So we're going to wrap up really soon. But if you have something burning you really want to ask and you somehow don't want people to know your name, and you can change your name, but if you, or you can actually in the chat just address the question to me and Elana. But if that makes you uncomfortable, you want to email me quickly now, I will keep an eye on my inbox for a minute.
I just caught a question at the bottom and I haven't had time to go through all of them. So I want to, but it's from a freelancer saying, how do you manage these issues of support in freelance situations without a well-funded organization? And those are real issues, but I think there can be communities created for freelancers. You probably know freelancers or independent folks that you could have a coffee hour with. ACOS, the Culture for Safety, is trying to create more opportunities for freelancers, particularly around the issues of physical safety. But there are opportunities, and I bet, Victoria, you have some comments about that too in terms of freelance, is that finding different ways, professional organizations, trainings like this, it is an issue, and I just want to acknowledge that.
The kinds of support, no, it's definitely an issue. And unfortunately, even existing news outlets right now that are kind of institutions are so strained financially that they don't have the resources to have physical security people, mental health people, so, or even access to mental health care. It's a real problem for a profession that is so trauma facing often. I mean, what I would say is what I'm going to include in the resources I send is a, I think it's the Anxiety Depression Association of America, I can never remember the acronym, but has a guide to free and low cost mental health care if you actually want to pursue professional counseling. Many, many news outlets, even the most cash-strapped ones, will have an EAP. And I don't know, people often poo-poo EAPs, but they actually can be useful. They have trained counselors on the other end. And if it's to get you through a pinch, talking for a few sessions to a trained counselor is better than not talking to anybody with training. And I would say, I've also, you know, I do really want to emphasize Elana's point about peer support groups. In the places that I've been, where I've been to newsrooms all over the country for the last year and a half, and in the places I've been where there are some kind of peer support group, the staff are usually doing much better than when there aren't any kind of peer support group. So just being able to sit down with people who are going through some of the same things you are, whether it's informally on Zoom or in a closed Facebook group or a closed WhatsApp group, and just venting and expressing frustration, but then also expressing a bunch of the coping mechanisms that you've shared and developed to get through something, can go a long way. And I will say that in this moment, there are actually quite a lot of free and low cost mental health resources. There's very, very good free meditation available of all kinds. Calm has free meditation available right now. The app Headspace does. Dartmouth and I think it's UCLA both have really, really good websites that are just like really phenomenal meditations, totally free. Like if you fish around, you can find some of these things. I know it's
for the person who thinks that they have PTSD, there's a PTSD coach app for some techniques that could work as well. There's a COVID-19 coping app. There's a COVID app for managing COVID-related distress. There are apps there as well for all these kinds of things. There are meditation sites. Yeah.
Well, I think we're starting to come up to time. I'm not seeing any more questions that I think that we haven't addressed. But I'll just say, you know, last call, but I'm not seeing, I don't think Elana and I missed anything. I think I've covered.
I'm looking now, I just am there. I may have missed some things on the chat, but hopefully you've also been sharing things. Yeah, I think.
So I will just say thank you all for joining us today. I know an hour and a half is a lot of time to take. I hope it was useful to you. I want to thank Elana profusely. We can't, you know, clap, snap or something, wave. You can only see us, but chat. Thank you, Elana, for your time and your expertise. This is technically like one of the last sessions of this series, but that's unless people want other topics for us to cover. If you reach out to me with something that you feel you really need us to cover, I will try to get it organized if I can find the right people. And just a reminder that, you know, PEN America, DART Center, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the International Women's Media Foundation, and the Freedom of the Press Foundation, we are here to serve journalists. So if you are feeling scared, stuck, alone, there are resources that you need, reach out to us, and we will do our best to help you. And if we can't, we'll try to find someone else who can. And take care of yourself and try to be safe. You know, it's a difficult time to be practicing journalism, but it's never been more vital. So try to take care of yourselves and stay as safe as you can.
Agreed.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Elana.
Bye, everybody.